Icebreaker. I want to.
First question.
Yeah, question or yeah.
Comment.
I have a question.
In the mic.
How many real domain experts have you seen in your life directly, side to side of your project?
How many real domain experts?
Yes,
that
you can work with, which just sit in front of you in 10 meters.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I guess that the answer is probably several, but you get different domain experts that know different things, that have different kind of availability. So it's really quite fluid. It's a surprisingly hard question to answer. I mean, of course, I don't know over my life but even if you were looking at one project, right? How many domain experts are available on this project right now might not even be a really easy question to answer, because you would say, well, what is the subject you want to talk about? Maybe there's that guy that you think knows everything about that aspect. But it is a problem. Sometimes it is a problem. I noticed that one of your slides said, well, if you don't have domain expert, go ahead and make a kind of a clean model on your own and do the best you can. I think you have to fill in the gaps at least sometimes. Yes, I do that. Or at least it gives you a proposal, and then when you do get a domain expert, you've got something to talk about. And so I do. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like, oh, you can't do anything or even think about anything without having a domain expert right there. You definitely should. I think about the domain all the time when I'm on a project. And sometimes solitary time, I think very deep. And then, you need a checkpoint. You need some kind of sanity check where you can go way off. I mean, you know, if you don't eventually have some kind of check, you can get very far out of the field, out of what's real for that domain. So,
well, I don't know how many, but the second best domain expert I ever met started out as the worst one, because he would come into meetings and we'd say stuff like, and here, I want you to add a table with these fields and these relations, and because he had done some programming like 20 years ago, and but then we started modeling with him, and he was very high up in the company. He had in the organization, he had like thousands of people that he was responsible for, but we started doing a lot of modeling with him on the whiteboard, not talking about code and features, but just about the problem space, and he really grew into that role. We started making sure that we never wasted his time with technical stuff. We learned what kind of coffee he likes. We bought him Belgian chocolates so that he would keep coming back, and that became one of the success factors in that project.
This point of not wasting their time, I think, is quite important, especially like what kind of things you talk about. I like to make sure, especially with a very senior person, that we take advantage of their ability to perhaps see the big picture and understand for example, the significant risks. And I try to, and if we get into discussing some scenario or some problem, and I say, but this seems kind of routine, kind of mundane, tell me a story about something that really worries you, you know, like something that keeps you up at night. If we can get into a subject that they care about, either because they think it's the exciting opportunity or they think it's the thing that they're really afraid of, either one of those things, and they will be very interested then, and it will be worth, because of course everyone has exactly the same amount of time, right? So it's a question of how much priority do you have, how important do they think it is?
Does anyone has a question in at the back of the room, or otherwise I have one for you guys. What will be the decision? How do you pick your project? How do you pick the project where you are involved in? Maybe Yves, if you have a...
Well, for me, there's a lot that goes into the interviewing process, basically, where I get a feel for what problems we're trying to solve, what type of people, what kind of attitude lives there. but it's not always a decisive factor because, I mean, it's fun to always do the nice projects or the easy projects, but I think it's also important to, from time to time, to challenge yourself and do something that is not as easy as it looks in the beginning, because that's where you might get the most insights compared to something that's going to be, a run-of-the-mill type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I really get bored quite easily with easy problems, as you call them. So I think if they start describing a problem and I think this is such a tangle, such a confusing, complicated situation, I'm not quite sure if I'll actually be able to do it this time. That's actually what gets me kind of excited and interested. But I must say, when I was earlier in my career, I think I had quite single-minded focus on choosing a project where I thought I would learn the most. I thought that I would be on a team with people who knew more than I did about whatever it was, who were really good designers, since that was something I really wanted to excel in. I wanted to be on a team with really good designers that were more advanced than me. I did not want to be the senior member of the team. For a long time, I went to a lot of trouble, and I didn't take necessarily the highest position I could have had. People would offer me jobs to be, I don't know, an architect or something. I'd say, no, I want that job because the architect on that team is someone I really want to learn from, you know. And I had this single-minded focus for a long time. Of course, my situation is very different now than it was then, but I think that's something to keep in mind when you're sort of trying to get started. You have to learn, and the best way to learn is from other people on your team that are better than you are at whatever it is you want to be really good at, and then just ruthlessly suck every bit of expertise out of their brain and then move on to the next one. But that's...
Back when I was, before I was a programmer, I wrote music. And the jobs I would, or the projects I would get involved with, I had a simple, pragmatic 3 rules. The first one, most important, was, is this interesting for artistic reasons? You know, will I be able to do interesting things and try things, etc., and learn from it? The second possible reason was, is this going to make me money? Which, as a musician, it never happens anyway. So it was more like a fantasy rule. And then the third one was, will this give me connections that may lead to one of the other 2 types of projects? And of course, if it's all 3, that's the best possible, which also never happened. But I still sort of have this heuristic in the back of my mind, I guess.
Yeah, and remember that, you know, the money that counts is the area under the curve, right? I mean, if you drew the curve over your whole career of decades, well, with some time value of money thrown in, you would, getting to the high pay immediately isn't as important as being able to sustain it for a long time. And believe me, the things you're learning now in a technological sense are going to be completely obsolete. I mean, I'm sort of talking to the younger people here, not everyone, but the things you learn now will be completely obsolete in 10 years, or 20 at the most, probably 10. So, do you want to be obsolete 10 years from now? You have to learn deep things, and that may not be the place with the biggest money, but if you can have a sustained, long career with good, exciting challenges, interesting people to work with, boy, this is sounding good.
So I think there's a misconception among software developers that your value as a programmer is the technologies that you know. But as Eric says, you know, they will be obsolete very soon. And that domain knowledge is sort of a very useless thing because next job will be in a completely different domain and it will be of no value. My feeling is that learning a domain, really deeply learning it, the skill is not in necessarily knowing that domain, but the skill is in learning to learn a domain. If you're good at learning a domain you've never encountered and build meaningful design for it, meaningful software for it, that's a transferable skill that will, you know, make you valuable everywhere, I think.
What would be your hint or your tips to how to be good at learn a domain? Do you have some advice?
So you're saying, how do we learn a
Yeah.
domain?
No, maybe it's for someone that will start his career here or that will rediscover the job. What would be your?
I think one essential piece is you have to actually cultivate a genuine interest. A lot of these domains are, they seem quite dull at first, but then once you get under the surface, you find that they're rich and there are rules and complexities to them. And then, of course, the interface between these domains and the software can be very interesting, too. But you have to get a little under the surface. A lot of things sound just very boring. And you have to have a real interest or you won't learn, you know. But if you're in a domain that you really are not interested in and you can't cultivate an interest, I think that would be, you know, when we were talking about how to choose a project, that would probably be another one. Choose one where you think the domain might be interesting, you know, where the problem they're working on might be interesting. For me, I've been involved in a lot of domains, and I've been able to cultivate an interest in a wide range of them, almost anything. But I must admit that insurance was an area that I found boring, and I got fairly deep into it, and I still found it kind of boring. So for me, probably I would tend to stay away from that domain. But for someone else, that might be really interesting. And it's also possible I never got to the interesting part, right? So I'm just giving that as an example that I think, but I think that is one thing. You have to be interested or you won't learn. And I don't know if there are other tips.
So the question was on how to learn, or? Look for it everywhere. I've read books on energy trading. I'm never going to be an energy trader or anything, but I read it because I had a client. I've, this sort of, actually there's a blog post by Veronica Labache. It's titled, What to Do If Your Domain is Boring. And it's actually beautiful, she describes how she works in a very boring sort of accounting domain, and then she starts to, and her colleagues are saying, yeah, but we cannot do DDD here because it's too boring, there's nothing interesting, it's just CRUD. And then she starts digging, and she keeps finding these things, and she becomes like I got excited about accounting just reading her her blog post.
There's one thing too, and it's kind of related to what modeling is for. If you go into something where things are sort of tidy, and you can immediately see how you would apply a kind of structure and a kind of mathematical order to it, like accounting, whatever, then those you know that you can use modeling and you can use advanced software design techniques. But if you go into something that seems like a just all quite arbitrary, ad hoc mess, and it's all tangled together, and it just seems to have no principles, that is a real challenge. If you want a challenge, you go in there and you try to find the principles. There almost always are some. I won't say there always are because I don't know, but in my experience, if you can drill in, you can find some principles, and you don't shy away from the complexity. You don't shove that over and say, well, let's address this little simple part. You say, let's look at that messy part. That's what really makes modeling pay off big if you can succeed. That's what gives me the most satisfaction. But it also requires a lot of learning because you have to get to the principle underneath. You have to why questions. Asking why questions, that's pretty important, right? Not just to learn, okay, this is how you do this thing. Why do you do that? And okay, now I know why you do that. So why is that important, the why for that? You get down to a deep enough level, and maybe you can start to see these things emerging from deeper principles. For that, you need a real domain expert, right? Someone who understands their own domain deeply enough to answer why. Not just a person who does this job. Maybe they do the job every day, but they don't really know why they do it. They just were taught to do that. Then that's not your domain expert. You need maybe the person that taught them. And if they can say, well, why did you teach them to do it that way? And so on. And you dig deeper. Why? but not in an obnoxious way, like, I think you don't have a good reason, why would you do that? But instead of, this is very interesting, explain to me why, that you learn a lot. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think the transferable skill when learning a domain is building up heuristics that you can reuse to learn faster. So heuristic doesn't solve your problem, but it gives you a new direction. One of those, for example, is follow the money. How does money flow in this domain? How do we make it? How do we spend it or lose it? Another one is follow the risk. Where are we doing certain processes, or which business rules specifically exist to reduce risk somewhere? And then how is that balance? How does this organization feel about risk? What's their sort of aversion to risk, and what are their sort of go-to strategies for dealing with risks? And are these even, they might be suboptimal, or they might even be adverse, but if you get this habit of looking for these things, you can go into any domain and start sort of uncovering the interesting, secret, hidden, unspoken assumptions faster.
Hi. I'm sure in your last years you've made one big mistake in implementing DDD, talking to people. If you had a chance to go back in time and fix this single mistake, what would you do?
Let me think about it first.
So there's some old poem or something, or a philosopher who said something about that an angel is, being blown backwards into the future. Out of paradise, the angel always wants to go back and fix things. And then that wind is called progress. So I think that's some European philosopher that said that. I can't remember who. So I think I'll...
Are we without mistakes, right?
No, I'm saying
yeah.
there's too many mistakes. You can't... This impulse to go back and fix is maybe not... The thing is, I think I learn a lot from those mistakes, okay? I've made so many terrible mistakes. I wouldn't even know where to begin to answer that question. I think that, though, you just kind of keep going. You try not to get too... I would say, for example, one big mistake that I used to make and I eventually stopped making was trying to make the model expand too big and cover too much territory. I did that on, I don't know, by the time I had enough, authority on a project to actually impose my will to some degree, I would say I probably made the mistake 2 times after that. Fortunately, I didn't have the dictatorial personality that makes it the project completely fail. So people would sort of defy that, and they would work around. And so I didn't cause the kind of disasters that some people do with that. But this idea that the model should, and I wasn't trying to make one model for everything, but a model for a whole lot. And that kind of mistake, I would say, yeah, I mean, going back, I would say that was a bad mistake. But really, I don't know how else you make progress. You break things, and then more time goes by, and other people break some things.
Well, we might argue that is one of the ways that you actually learn things as well, is by allowing yourself to make mistakes. One of the mistakes I used to make in the past was not to listen too carefully enough, basically, for example, to domain expert, not listen to nuances that they were saying. So not being attentive to, enough, because maybe at that point in time I was too infatuated with either technology or other things that were going on the project. So that would be one that I can confess to.
Okay, I remember one. This one I really do regret, because I think if I could go back, because I think the trajectory of the project probably could have been different. I remember this on 2 different projects, a very similar story, that we had a part of the design that was really not good. It was all tied together, and it was a real problem. And we had been working, and I thought we had a model that would fix it. And then we go in and we start to try to refactor the system to the new design. But we discover that it is entangled with something else. So the difficulty of refactoring gets a little bit bigger. And so we say, all right, well, let's buckle down, you know, be tough, and we keep going. And a couple of weeks later, we realized that the problem is even bigger. We didn't think this would take a couple of weeks, right? But now it's a couple of weeks, and the system is basically all taken apart, and we, you know, like if you've disassembled something and you don't know how to put it back together again. And instead of saying at that point, and this is what I wish, if I could go back, I would say to my young self at that point, I would say, just roll it all back. Just stop this now before anything else bad happens. Go back, because you can just in the version system, just push one button and everything goes back 2 weeks. And yes, all that work is gone, but you don't know what you're getting into. We had a presentation earlier this evening about the Vietnam War, right? The word that Americans usually use to describe the Vietnam War, the word quagmire will always come into that conversation. A quagmire is like muddy ground, and if you start walking in it, the further you walk, the more difficult it is to walk, and then you get pulled in more and so on, and you just can't get out. And the only answer is to just get out. Just get out of the quagmire. And then just start the project moving again and catch your breath and think about, why did that not work? Is there some other way we could fix this bad part of the system? But don't get caught. And I think I can think of 2 projects where I did real damage to the project that probably changed the trajectory, a chance to build something really fine. We ended up building something okay, but not really wonderful because of that mistake. So that's a mistake I don't really make anymore, because I am so brutally aware that all that work you put in, well, it's better to flush it down the toilet and go back to a place where you know you can actually do things. And so there's my answer. And now I'm feeling that very viscerally.
Well, I've never been on a project that lost as many money or lives as Vietnam, but I was on a project that was for managing NGOs, so non-profits. And so it was a small company that built these products, and the owner wasn't available very often. And I was sort of, I was too inexperienced, but I was left in charge of a project. And every now and then he would come into the office and we would have modeling sessions. And that was sort of when I started getting really interested in modeling. It was before, I remember it was before I read your book, because I remember it being on my desk unopened for months. So maybe I should have started sooner. But every time he would come in, every couple of weeks, we would be, you know, having fun modeling stuff on the whiteboard. But with every iteration of that model, it became more generic and more abstract. And after, I think I was on that for 8 or 10 months. By the end, we had basically designed a key value store over HTTP, and everything else that would have, you know, in our minds, it would all be implemented in the client. So basically, there was nothing left of the product. And then the money ran out, and we delivered nothing at all. So
before we eat and drink, does anyone have a last question? Yeah?
So good evening. I have a question about the association between the DDD and microservices. So I'm one of many people I know who started getting interested in DDD through the books and the presentations done about microservices and the new architecture and style. So do you think that this is the way to go for modern applications? And the second question is this the way to go for any project, or do you think there is some point of complexity from which we can start applying DDD and expect its to get a return of investment on it?
Okay.
So I'll start with the old Ddd microservices connection. That kind of started because when I started hearing, I want to be kind of specific because microservices means many things now. And so I started seeing presentations mostly from people from Netflix and a few places like that. But Netflix was the one that always inspired me when I saw these people talking about it, and I said, ah, yes, that's really different and breaks through a lot of assumptions. And one of the things I liked was that a microservice was very autonomous and that it had a real boundary within which, for example, you had a database and you had a team that could do what they wanted inside that boundary. I said, well, the trouble with the bounded context concept is that it's so abstract, the boundaries are so hard to see in a traditional system. The monolith that we build makes these boundaries really difficult to see. Microservices makes the boundaries much easier to see. And I said, I think that what they're doing is they are using the bounded context pattern with a real physical boundary, with a tradition on their teams that allows them to do what they want within that boundary. And I think that's what you need to do domain-driven design. Not that you need microservices, but you need that boundary. And the more abstract forms of boundaries, a logically defined boundary within a system that isn't really physically separated, sometimes that works, but usually it doesn't work. And I just say that not from any theoretical reasoning, because for a long, long time I just thought it should work, but I just observed that it usually does not work. And then it does seem to work when you have a physical boundary. Of course, microservices will present many problems of their own. The most obvious one I would say is fragmentation. So once you have hundreds of services, how do you understand all that? Right? And I have some thoughts on that. But so I'm not saying I think microservices is a solution to all our problems, but that is what really drew me to it, right? And I think that, yes, there are projects where you can probably say there won't be very much payoff to these techniques. Of course, microservices was originally not conceived as a way to enable complex modeling. It was a way to scale a very large system in terms of volume of data and transactions and so on. So for that, so there's different axes, right? When we say, like, you could have a very simple system where you still need to scale to millions of transactions, and then you might need microservices simply for those characteristics. Or you might have a really quite low, and this is what I've worked on probably more often, is systems where the transaction volume is not that challenging. An old-fashioned, relatively centralized system could handle it, but you want to have the logical partitioning and some of the other benefits. So, you know, there might be benefits to using the microservices architecture, even though you don't need to scale to very high volumes, but you have enough domain complexity and you want to be able to partition well so that you get those benefits, but then you're not going to worry about those other things. And then if you don't have any of these, you have a really simple problem and you don't have to scale it, then of course I think I would not use it. So.
I think that was a pretty complete answer, to be honest. Any more questions?
I was wondering if you follow the progress or status of the projects that you were involved on in 2 or 3, 5 years after you were involved, and what have it taught you if you follow them?
I can really answer that question because I usually am involved for years in the projects I do. I think there's a very different perspective that you get as you evolve. It's kind of natural as well, in the sense that when you look back on things is that your assumptions, your preconceptions of how things are going to be most often turn out to be totally different as you progress. Basically, the things that you thought were important are becoming less important, or things tend to shift sometimes. And I tend to also agree with Eric that I also observe the fact that sometimes you try to chew off too big a piece, basically, or you build something that grows into and becomes too big. And that's also kind of what I try to hint at with inertia, is this constant nurturing or distillation, actually, basically, of is what we've put into this model all still necessary, or is it more something that we're carrying along from, the beginning years that we started out with this concept of thinking, well, maybe it's like this, and then as you continue into the project, you're basically realizing that some of these things that you put in place are actually not needed anymore in the same place, but can move on to a different place. That would be my answer to that.
Thank you.
I think it's important to, in the old days, I used to worry that eventually it seemed like projects would be going really well for a while and we would do some things, and then something, if I was in touch with the project long enough to know, it would eventually not be like that anymore, and the ability to change would be lost. And I used to say quite cynically that the ultimate destiny of all software projects is to become a big ball of mud, and so and so the question is, how long can you keep it from becoming a big ball of mud before it gets to that? But I'm not so concerned about that anymore, because I think that there are little periods of time when you're able to do certain things, where all the political aspects are just right, and the team is capable, and the software is still clean enough that you can make changes, and they actually have needs that justify all that, and all those things come together, and for one wonderful year, you do all sorts of things. And then one of those factors, any one of those factors is gone, and it stops. You don't have the team anymore. You don't have the political backing anymore. You don't, you've kind of solved the immediate problem, and they don't really, yes, they always want things, but do they really need them, and so on. So I've come to think that that's okay. That's the way it is, you know. We shouldn't, microservices sort of bounds things sort of in, you know, you could say in spatial dimension, the scope of a project in terms of how big things are. But I'm saying, well, we maybe sort of need to scope them in time too. And there are these little moments when you can do this. So, but the last chapter in my book, the very last chapter in my book is called Epilogues. And it's actually what I knew about what had happened to all the projects that I discussed in the book later on, after I was gone. So that's one, there's a few of my stories there.
Well, I think the beer are getting warmer. The pizza will getting ready, so maybe we can a round of applause for those gents. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.